Well, I'm willing to bet you didn't see this one coming. Sneaky, right? That's kind of the point. Yeah, I'm skipping ahead a generation for this one, but don't worry, the older game videos are still coming because there are literally hundreds of your recommendations that I still have to get to. But since I've been showing so much love to the SNES, Sega Genesis, somewhat at least, don't worry, that system is definitely going to get more love here in the near future, and NES, I figured it would only be right to start showing a little bit of love to slightly newer but still retro games. Well, in comes one of the most revolutionary, famous, and beloved games of all time, Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 1. Hey there all you beautiful guardians of the glaze, welcome back to the Milky Donut. If you're new here, this is the Milky Donut. We do all things video games, movies, and pop culture. And if you're not new here, you know this channel actually has a setting where it will only let you click the subscribe button if you're extremely attractive, so you must be stunning. Well, before we yet again fire up our video game time travel machine, as always, I'd like to mention that I do have a goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers as quickly as I can, and we're getting so close. So if you could go ahead and like this video, leave the glaziest of comments, hype it if you can, and subscribe if you think it's worthy of the algorithm. As always, shout out to the current subscriber of the week, Mr. Steven P5476, and feel free to hype up this video because you could very well be the next MVP. And with all that nonsense out of the way, let's ever so quietly jump into our video game time travel machine and play some old school video games. There are a lot of games that you guys have told me to play, that of which I have videos on my channel talking about my experiences discovering them for the very first time. Games that didn't simply succeed within their genre, but fundamentally changed the way developers and players alike thought when it came to what video games could be. Well, in 1998, one of those games arrived in the form of Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 1. During my research for this video, which I always do, I discovered that this was during a time when the gaming industry was still learning how to perfect the transition from 2D into 3D worlds. Now sure, there were plenty of earlier games that had already done that time and time again by this point, and very well at that, but Metal Gear Solid did something very few games had attempted before. It combined stealth gameplay, cinematic storytelling, complex characters, and technical innovation into an experience that would go on to influence an entire generation of game design. Now, as you probably know by now, I had never played a single Metal Gear game up until this point. But Metal Gear Solid was one of the very first recommendations I remember seeing in the comments near the beginning of this series. And like a few other characters that I've talked about in the past, Snake was yet another character that I only knew from Super Smash Bros. Brawl. But unlike Ness, who I foolishly thought was an exclusive character to Smash Bros., I at least knew that Snake was from his own series, that of course being the Metal Gear series. And I always thought he was a cool character, but for some reason I just never played his games. I didn't even know that this sound was from Metal Gear, so that was a great revelation. Well, in my opinion, nearly 3 decades later, it still remains one of the clearest examples of a game being far ahead of its time. To understand why Metal Gear Solid was such a monumental release, it helps to understand the landscape of gaming during that sweet, sweet year of 1998. Again, according to my research, that year is often remembered as one of the most important years for stealth games, with the release of 3 major titles that helped define the genre: FromSoft's Tenchu, Stealth Assassins, Looking Glass Studios' Thief, and Konami's Metal Gear Solid. While all 3 games did make meaningful contributions to stealth design, Metal Gear Solid became the game that left the most impactful mark on the industry. Entire franchises that would come later, including titles such as Splinter Cell, owe much of their existence to the foundation that Metal Gear Solid established. One of the most impressive things about Metal Gear Solid is that despite being released in the late 1990s, its design philosophy still feels incredibly deliberate even by modern standards. But do I even need to say modern standards, because you all know how I feel about that. But unlike many 3D action games of that era that encouraged players to simply brute force your way through levels, Metal Gear Solid built its identity around avoidance, patience, and strategy. Instead of rewarding aggression, the game teaches you patience. You're encouraged to observe guard patrol patterns while studying enemy movement, and think carefully about how to move through each environment undetected. And this might seem basic now, but at the time, stealth as a fully realized gameplay mechanic was still in its infancy stage. A huge reason this system worked so well was because of how transparent the game mechanics were. Hideo Kojima and his team clearly understood that stealth gameplay could quickly become frustrating if you didn't fully understand the rules. Guards behaved predictably, but intentionally so. If you knocked on a wall, enemies would investigate. If you pressed up against a wall, enemies can only see you from certain angles. Every mechanic is consistent, allowing you to slowly master the systems and feel rewarded for carefully planning. It's actually extremely fun and satisfying in ways I didn't expect. In many ways, Metal Gear Solid established the blueprint that countless stealth games would follow for years afterwards. But perhaps the game's most important gameplay innovation was the radar system. Positioned in the corner of the screen, the radar constantly feeds you critical information about nearby enemies, map layouts, patrol routes, and enemy field of vision. This single mechanic removed any ambiguity from stealth gameplay that could have made the experience overly tedious and transformed the gameplay from trial and error into calculated decision making. It's something so simple but extremely impactful, going to show yet again, like many of these older games seem to understand, sometimes less is indeed more. Of course, modern stealth games have evolved these systems significantly, at least the few that I've played, but Metal Gear Solid was one of the earliest examples of giving players this much environmental awareness without making the UI feel overly intrusive, which is another issue that I feel plagues many releases these days. Metal Gear Solid's camera design also deserves an equal amount of praise. In the late 1990s, developers were still experimenting with how 3D camera systems should function, and this was actually one of my biggest concerns going into this, because a lot of games, especially from the PS1 era, seemed to struggle with camera layouts. At least from what I remember. Keep in mind, I was like 5 when I first ever played a PlayStation 1 game, and that was years after the system released, so take everything I'm saying with a huge grain of sugar. But I do remember a lot of games having awkward player-controlled cameras that often made movement feel clunky or disorienting. Metal Gear Solid avoided this issue almost entirely by using a top-down fixed perspective that was inherited from earlier entries in the series. Again, I didn't even know this wasn't the first game in the series. Idiot Milky take as usual. Well, this allows you to navigate fully 3D environments without fighting against the limitations of early camera technology. The game would consistently shift perspectives during first-person aiming or while hiding against walls, and doing so ever so smoothly, ensuring that you always had relevant visual information without overwhelming you. But gameplay innovation alone is not why Metal Gear Solid has remained relevant for nearly 30 years and is still amazing for a modern gamer like myself to pick up today. The game was equally revolutionary in the way it approached its storytelling. Prior to Metal Gear Solid, most video game narratives were relatively simple, not all, especially in Saturday's videos, so tune in for that. But even some of the best stories of that era often boiled down to pretty straightforward journeys to defeat an evil force or save the world, which there's nothing wrong with that, but Metal Gear Solid told its story differently. At a surface level, the story is relatively simple. Solid Snake is sent to infiltrate Shadow Moses Island, which is a nuclear weapons disposal facility in Alaska, to stop a rogue terrorist unit from launching a devastating nuclear attack using a bipedal walking weapon known as Metal Gear Rex. But what makes that story remarkable is everything that's layered beneath that somewhat simple premise. Throughout the game, you're pulled into a web of political conspiracies, military deception, genetic experimentation, nuclear deterrence, and philosophical questions surrounding identity and destiny. The narrative constantly expands beyond the immediate mission, making the world feel larger and far more complex than what players had come to expect from many games during that era. Hideo Kojima's writing style, which keep in mind was heavily inspired by film, brought a level of cinematic ambition that few developers were even attempting to do around that time. This cinematic presentation was arguably just as groundbreaking as the gameplay itself, because Metal Gear Solid featured lengthy dialogue sequences, which is a very fine line because you know how I feel about overly self-indulgent cutscenes and dialogue dumps, but I never got the feeling that they overstayed their welcome here. There were carefully choreographed in-engine cutscenes with dramatic camera work and performances that gave its characters an unprecedented sense of realism. While it may be easy for a lot of modern players to take these things for granted, this level of storytelling presentation was almost unheard of in 1998. Kojima treated video games not as simple vessels for entertainment, but as a medium capable of delivering stories with the same emotional complexity as cinema. But for me, that's a bittersweet success because I feel that somewhere along the way, video games started focusing way too much on the video portion of its name and not so much the game part. But nonetheless, this philosophy extended directly into the game's characters, which remain some of the most memorable in gaming history. Solid Snake is far more than the generic action hero that I've seen time and time again. He's a battle-worn soldier constantly questioning his purpose and the systems he serves. Honestly, he's super-based. The members of Foxhound, which is the game's antagonistic special forces unit, each possess their own motivations, internal conflicts, and personalities that feel surprisingly nuanced given the era that they were born into. Because a lot of video game characters that were written during the 1990s were rarely written with this level of moral ambiguity, and Metal Gear Solid proved that games could create characters that were just as, if not more compelling than those found in film. And of course, there were the boss fights, which remain some of the most iconic ever created and some of my favorite parts of the entire game. And what makes them so memorable is how creatively they break away from the core gameplay loop. The battle against Psycho Mantis has become legendary, and for good reason. I discovered that back in the day, the game would read the player's memory card, forcing players to physically switch controller ports to defeat him, which I can only imagine how insanely cool that was to see for the first time. In that moment, the game shatters any boundary between you as the player and the software in a way that felt genuinely shocking. While it is technically still present, the gimmick is more of a sudden setting swap rather than a physical interruption, which is cool that it's included, but there's no way it even holds a candle to the original experience. But even for me now, it remains one of the most creative uses of fourth wall breaking in any game that I've ever played. Keep in mind, I do little to no research about these games before I play them, so I always go in as blindly as possible. But there are other moments that are equally memorable. The sniper duel against Sniper Wolf is badass. The final confrontation on top of Metal Gear Rex against Liquid Snake delivers blockbuster level action on a scale that I can only imagine very few games of that era could match. And rather than feeling disconnected from the game's stealth-focused foundation, these encounters constantly refresh the experience and prevent the gameplay from ever becoming repetitive, which is something I definitely thought would happen because I'm actually not much of a stealth game guy. At least I didn't think I was. Well, turns out, game with good game design good, who would have thought? But one of the biggest reasons Metal Gear Solid works so well for me is because of its pacing. As I've said plenty of times before, modern games often feel obligated to stretch their content across dozens of hours and usually at the expense of quality. Well, Metal Gear Solid is remarkably concise by comparison, with my playthrough lasting about 8.5 hours. Yet nearly every moment feels purposeful. There's very little filler, very little wasted time, and the game constantly introduces new mechanics, environments, story developments, and boss encounters that keep the experience engaging from beginning to end. But perhaps most importantly, Metal Gear Solid proved that video games could be something more than mechanical entertainment. It demonstrated that games could indeed tell sophisticated stories and explore mature political themes, experiment with unconventional design ideas, and create experiences that players would remember for decades in a time when many people, uncultured lame people, still saw video games as something for kids. Without Metal Gear Solid, the future of cinematic gaming looks very different. Now, whether that would have been a good or a bad different, who's to know? But regardless, Metal Gear Solid is an absolute banger of a game. And with that, we come to the end of our time travel journey. As always, I had an absolute blast with playing Metal Gear Solid, and it was fun to switch up the genres a bit. But do you prefer old games or new games? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see more of this, feel free to drop what you'd like to see next in the comments as well. As always, don't forget to like, comment, hype, and subscribe to become a guardian of the glaze, and I'll see you next time on the Milky Donut.